The North Sea is a canvas of cold gray. April 14, 1945. 14 miles from the coast of Scotland, something moves in the deep. Beneath the waves, the German submarine U-1206 glides through the darkness, a ghost running on silent electric power. 200 feet below the surface, the pressure is immense. The war is over. They just haven't been told. On the European continent, the great war machine of the Third Reich was grinding to a halt. The end was not weeks away, it was days. Yet here, this steel tube and its crew of 50 men remained a lethal threat, armed with torpedoes and the grim professionalism of soldiers fighting a war already lost. Orders were orders. Surrender was not in their nature. In the control room, Captain Karl Adolf Schlitt studies the navigation charts. This is his first patrol as commander. A 32-year-old officer, seasoned as a watchman, but new to the crushing weight of ultimate responsibility. His vessel, a Type 7C, was the workhorse of the U-boat fleet, a design that had once terrorized the Atlantic. These wolves of the sea had sent thousands of Allied ships to the bottom. But that was another time. By the spring of 1945, the Atlantic had become a graveyard for submarines. Allied advances in air power, in sonar, in radar, and in the secret war of code-breaking had turned the hunter into the hunted. Survival was measured in patrols, and many U-boats never returned from their first. 8 days out from their base in Norway, the mission had been quiet. A few distant echoes, nothing more. The crew fell into the familiar claustrophobic rhythm of life at sea. The rotations of the watch, the constant maintenance, the unnerving silence when an enemy aircraft was detected overhead. Survival in this steel tube wasn't just about evading the enemy. It was a battle against the machine itself, against the crushing intimacy of 50 men confined to a space smaller than a city bus. And it was a battle against the fundamental realities of the human body. One of those realities was sanitation. Early submarines had relied on simple buckets, but as missions grew longer, as boats stayed submerged for weeks, a more sophisticated solution was needed. The challenge was engineering a toilet that could function against the colossal pressure of the deep ocean. At 200 feet, the water outside exerts a force of 87 pounds on every square inch of the hull. Inside, the air pressure is a normal 14.7 pounds. The ocean itself, a relentless force, is trying to breach any opening, to flood any weakness. An outflow pipe for a toilet becomes a potential gateway for the sea. A complex system of valves and levers, designed to conquer a basic human need, was about to become the vessel's undoing. In the silent, crushing deep, the smallest mistake could be the last one. And the North Sea was waiting. Life aboard a German U-boat was an assault on the senses, a constant, metallic chill, the perpetual hum of machinery, and above all, the smell. A suffocating cocktail of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and stale air, trapped for weeks on end within a steel coffin. To this potent atmosphere, another element was added: human waste. In the early days, it was collected in holding tanks, vast internal bladders that consumed precious space and amplified the already legendary stench. A submarine is a machine of pure function, and every cubic inch is dedicated to the mission. Holding tanks were a compromise, an inefficient and deeply unpleasant one. German engineering, in its relentless pursuit of efficiency, devised a solution of lethal elegance: the high-pressure, deep-water toilet, a marvel of plumbing that could eject waste directly into the crushing depths of the ocean, freeing the U-boat from the tyranny of the holding tank. The concept was deceptively simple. Waste would enter a small pressure chamber. This chamber would then be flooded with compressed air, its internal pressure raised to exceed that of the surrounding sea. A valve would open, and the contents would be fired into the abyss. A quick rinse with seawater, and the system was ready again. It was a clean, brilliant, and deeply dangerous idea. The system demanded absolute precision. It was a mechanical riddle, a test of memory and nerve, conducted in a space barely larger than a closet. A precise, unforgiving sequence where a single error in judgment could invite the ocean inside. Not as a leak, but as a weapon. A high-pressure jet of seawater, powerful enough to slice through steel, capable of flooding a compartment in mere moments. This was not a system for the untrained. It was a specialized piece of equipment, and on most U-boats, the crew was instructed to use the simpler, older toilet in the bow. The high-tech marvel was for specialists only. By April 14, 1945, the war was in its death throes. The U-boat fleet, once the terror of the Atlantic, was being systematically hunted and destroyed. On board U-1206, a state-of-the-art Type 7C submarine, the pressure was not just outside the hull. It was in the minds of every man. The captain, Karl Adolf Schlitt, needed a moment of solitude. The forward head was crowded, a hub of activity with no privacy. His quarters were aft, near the engine room, and conveniently close to the advanced high-pressure toilet. It was a simple choice of convenience. A small, personal decision made in the final weeks of a global conflict. He stepped into the tiny compartment. The walls were a dense tapestry of pipes, gauges, and hand wheels. In the dim, functional light, the posted instructions were a complex diagram of cause and effect. The captain initiated the sequence. Close the inner valve to the bowl. Open the valve to the pressure chamber. A hiss of displaced air. Close the chamber valve, sealing the contents inside. Now the critical step. Open the valve to the compressed air line, turning the chamber into a loaded cannon. Then the moment of truth. Open the outer hull valve, unleashing the contents into the sea. Close the outer valve. Open the seawater rinse. Close it. Depressurize. Reset. Somewhere in that intricate ballet of hands and steel, a mistake was made. A valve opened out of turn. Perhaps the inner valve to the bowl was not fully sealed. Instead of waste going out, the full, crushing weight of the Atlantic came in. A torrent of frigid seawater erupted into the compartment, a violent, unstoppable force. The delicate balance between the world inside the submarine and the world outside was shattered. Alarms screamed. Men shouted. The water, now mixed with chlorine gas leaking from the submerged batteries directly below, filled the compartment, then the next. There was no containing it. The U-boat was mortally wounded, poisoned from within by the very ocean it was designed to conquer. Captain Schlitt had no choice. He gave the order to surface, a desperate gamble in waters swarming with enemy patrols. U-1206 breached the surface, a wounded beast gasping for air. But it was too late. The damage was too severe. The boat was scuttled, its crew abandoning ship. Their war ended not by a depth charge or a torpedo, but by a catastrophic plumbing failure. A testament to the fact that in the unforgiving deep, the greatest threat is not always the enemy, but a single, simple mistake. A single turn of the wrong valve in the smallest room on a vessel designed to master the very depths that would ultimately claim it. Deep beneath the waves, the world is reduced to pressure and steel. Inside the claustrophobic hull of a German U-boat, every sound has meaning. The hum of the electric motors, the creak of the bulkheads, the rhythmic ping of sonar. It is a self-contained universe, a predator holding its breath in the crushing dark. In this world, routine is survival. Every procedure, every sequence is a liturgy learned by heart. A single man, performing a task he has done countless times before, stands in a cramped compartment. He is surrounded by a complex network of levers and valves. A marvel of late-war German engineering, designed to function hundreds of feet below the surface. He opens a valve. He closes another. He listens for the familiar, reassuring hiss of compressed air, the sound of a system working as intended. But the sound is wrong. The gauges offer readings that defy logic. The sequence, which felt so correct in his hands, has produced an error. He tries again. A different combination, a slight adjustment. And then, a new sound cuts through the familiar hum of the submarine. A sound that does not belong. A sound no submariner ever wants to hear. It is the sound of a violation. The shriek of high-pressure water unleashed. He had opened the wrong valve. Instead of expelling waste into the ocean, he had invited the ocean in. The cold, crushing weight of the Atlantic, now inside the hull. Seawater erupts into the compartment at 87 pounds per square inch. A brutal geyser of freezing salt water smashes against the ceiling, ricochets off the walls. It is not a leak, it is an assault. He fumbles with the valves, his hands slipping on the wet steel. But the physics are against him. The immense pressure of the deep now works to keep the wrong valve open, jamming the mechanism. The compartment is flooding. Fast. He throws open the door, a torrent of water spilling out behind him as he shouts for help. The engineering officer, a man whose mind is a living blueprint of the submarine's intricate systems, arrives in seconds. His assessment is instant and grim. The wrong valves are open. The sea is pouring in. Within minutes, the compartment will be completely submerged, its weight threatening the submarine's delicate balance. He too fights the controls, but the battle is already lost. The pressure is too great. He makes a critical decision, not as an engineer, but as a survivor. He slams the watertight door to the toilet compartment, spinning the wheel that seals it shut. The flooding is contained. One small space is sacrificed to save the whole. For a moment, the rest of the submarine is safe. But the water, now trapped, finds new paths. It begins to drip, then trickle, through deck plates and cable passages. Its destination is the compartment directly below, the submarine's batteries. These are not simple batteries. They are massive banks of lead-acid cells, the silent heart that powers the U-boat's underwater propulsion. And they are filled with sulfuric acid. A lethal alchemy begins. Seawater meets acid. The chemical reaction is immediate, and it creates a ghost, an invisible killer, chlorine gas. The crew smells it first, as alarm bells clang through the steel corridors. The engineering crew scrambles, but they are fighting an enemy they cannot see. The gas is spreading faster than they can vent it, seeping through ventilation shafts, under sealed doors, into every corner of the vessel. Men begin to cough, a dry, hacking sound that echoes in the confined space. Their eyes burn, their throats constrict, each breath a painful, ragged effort. The captain now faces the ultimate calculus of command. To remain submerged is to condemn his entire crew to a slow, agonizing death by chlorine poisoning. The steel predator would become their tomb. He has no choice. There is only one desperate path to survival. He gives the order. Emergency surface, blow all ballast tanks, full rise on the diving planes. An immediate explosive ascent to the surface, regardless of the enemy ships or aircraft that might be waiting in the unforgiving light of day. The most sophisticated weapon of its time, a silent hunter of the abyss, was not undone by a depth charge or an enemy torpedo. It was defeated from within, crippled by a flaw in its most mundane system, and a single human error deep beneath the waves. The ocean's surface shatters. A surge of steel and foam breaks through into the blinding daylight, a leviathan gasping for air. The conning tower hatch flies open, and men spill onto the deck. They are not conquerors. They are survivors, choking, retching, their lungs seared by the ghostly green tendrils of chlorine gas that filled their world only moments before. Captain Karl Adolf Schlitt ascends to the bridge, the cold North Sea wind a brutal shock against his skin. He raises his binoculars, his hands steady despite the chaos. To the east, a jagged line on the horizon, the Scottish coast. And then, his blood runs cold. A shape in the sky. A dark cross against the unforgiving gray. An aircraft. Then another. British Coastal Command patrol planes, already turning. In less than 8 minutes, the first hunter is upon them. A British short Sunderland flying boat, a 4-engined Angel of Deeg, ground into a graveyard. The Sunderland begins a slow, deliberate circle, its crew calmly confirming the impossible prize below. A German U-boat, wounded and exposed on the surface. Radio waves crackle across the miles. A message is sent. Submarine surfaced, 14 miles off Aberdeen, preparing to attack. On the bridge of U-1206, Schlitt watches the circling predator and understands the brutal arithmetic of his situation. His options have narrowed to a razor's edge. To dive is to die. The battery compartment below is a toxic cauldron of seawater and chlorine. The batteries themselves compromised beyond repair. Attempting to submerge would be a death sentence, a self-inflicted execution in the crushing dark. There is the deck gun, the anti-aircraft weapons. They were designed for this very moment, a last defiant snarl at the hunters in the sky. But to engage a Sunderland was to invite annihilation. These flying boats were heavily armed, bristling with machine guns and laden with depth charges. More than that, to fire a single shot was to guarantee a fight to the finish. Other aircraft would be summoned. Royal Navy destroyers would steam from port. His U-boat would be hounded, torn apart, and sent to the bottom. Then there is the other path, surrender. The ultimate humiliation for a U-boat captain, a man forged in the crucible of the Atlantic's silent war. To lower the flag, to signal submission, to become a prisoner. Yet Schlitt was a pragmatist. His state-of-the-art war machine, a predator of the deep, was crippled not by a destroyer's cunning or a torpedo's fury, but by a simple, catastrophic failure of its high-pressure toilet. His crew was poisoned, and the war itself was in its death throes. Germany would capitulate within weeks. What was the point of dying now, for a cause already lost, in a battle sparked by a plumbing disaster? Before the calculus of honor and survival can resolve in his mind, the Sunderland makes the decision for him. The aircraft banks, its great wings tilting against the sky, and dives. Dark shapes detach from its belly, tumbling through the air. Depth charges. They tear into the sea around the submarine, and the world erupts. The explosions are deafeningly close, a series of colossal thumps that lift the U-boat from the water and slam it back down. Geysers of white water, 100 feet high, claw at the sky. Men on deck are thrown from their feet, their bodies ragdolled across the slick steel. Schlitt clings to the bridge, the violent shudder of his vessel traveling up his bones. The British were not waiting for a white flag. They were not offering quarter. In the brutal logic of total war, a surfaced U-boat was a threat until it was wreckage. The enemy had answered his question for him. The time for choices was over. The anti-aircraft crews clawed their way to their stations. The final, futile battle for U-1206 had begun. The 20mm cannon on the conning tower barks into the cold North Sea air, a desperate, defiant sound. Green tracer rounds claw at the sky, stitching frantic patterns toward the circling Sunderland flying boat. The British aircraft banks hard, its massive frame a dark silhouette against the gray ceiling of cloud, easily evading the fire before wheeling around for another pass. A predator toying with its wounded prey. Below the churning surface, inside the steel hull of U-boat 1206, a far more insidious battle is being lost. The air itself has become the enemy. A pale, yellow-green mist, the spectral signature of chlorine gas, seeps through the bulkheads. It burns the lungs, sears the eyes. Men collapse at their stations, gasping for breath that offers no relief, only poison. The engineering crew fights on, but this is a war they cannot win. The initial crisis, a catastrophic flood in the head, has been contained. But the seawater that cascaded into the submarine has already done its work. It found the massive lead-acid batteries, the very heart of the vessel. A chemical reaction, violent and irreversible, has turned the battery compartment into a toxic chamber. The batteries are not merely ruined, they are actively trying to kill the crew. And with their death comes the death of the boat itself. The intricate web of electrical systems begins to fail. The steady hum of the gyros falters. Navigation equipment goes dark. The radio, their only link to the outside world, falls silent. Lights flicker, then extinguish one by one, plunging compartments into a terrifying metallic darkness. The U-boat is dying from the inside out. The chief engineer's report to Captain Karl Adolf Schlitt is not a recommendation. It is a verdict. They have perhaps an hour of emergency power left, maybe less. And if the chlorine gas cannot be cleared, an impossible task, even that hour is a fleeting dream. His words are blunt, stripped of all protocol. Abandon ship. Get the men out before the sea claims them, or before British bombs tear the hull apart. Schlitt stands in the dim light of the control room, the world collapsing around him. The submarine is crippled, unable to dive, its greatest strength stolen away. On the surface, they are a sitting duck. Enemy aircraft circle above. More ships, alerted by radio, are surely racing toward their position. His crew, the men he has sworn to protect, are choking in the dark below. The mission, his first combat patrol as commander, is over. A complete failure. And the cause? The almost laughable, incomprehensible absurdity of it all. This was not the glorious, tragic end of a desperate convoy battle. U-boat 1206 was not hunted down by a coordinated wolf pack of destroyers, nor shattered by a barrage of depth charges. It was defeated by its own sanitation system. A single, catastrophic error in the submarine's state-of-the-art, high-pressure toilet. A piece of technology designed for the crushing depths of the ocean had accomplished in minutes what the entire Royal Navy and Royal Air Force had failed to do in 8 days of patrol. It had forced them to the surface and rendered them helpless. For Captain Schlitt, the calculus is brutal, and the conclusion inescapable. The order is given, his voice steady against the rising chaos. Prepare to abandon ship. A new, grim purpose fills the submarine. The crew moves with disciplined haste. Life rafts are readied for inflation on the deck. Sensitive equipment, the Enigma machine, the sonar arrays, are systematically destroyed with hammers and crowbars. Codebooks, heavy with lead weights, are carried topside and plunged into the depths, their secrets forever consigned to the sea. The submarine's war diary, a final testament to its short life, is sealed in a waterproof container. There is no time for personal belongings. Every second is precious. On the deck, men line up, their life jackets secured, their faces turned toward the circling Sunderland. They wait for the final command. Then, a new shape appears on the horizon, a second Sunderland, responding to the first's contact report. The situation has shifted from dire to catastrophic. 2 aircraft now circle the doomed submarine, ensuring there can be no escape. Hope, if any remained, is extinguished. Schlitt gives his last command. The scuttling charges are to be prepared. Every U-boat carried these explosives, a final, defiant act of self-destruction to deny the enemy their prize. The charges are placed in the submarine's most critical locations: the engine room, the control room, the forward torpedo room, a promise of a swift, violent end waiting to be fulfilled. Deep within the hull, the scuttling charges were set. Not weapons of attack, but instruments of self-destruction. A final, defiant act, governed by cold, unyielding procedure. A U-boat was never to be taken intact. Its secrets, its technology, its very existence as a trophy for the enemy, all must be denied. Better to send the vessel to the ocean floor and commit the men to the mercy of the sea. The timers were engaged. 10 minutes. A fragile window of time for the crew to escape the steel tomb they once called home. Then the order echoed through the compartments. Abandon ship. One by one, they began to leap into the North Atlantic. The water was a shock to the system, a brutal 50 degrees Fahrenheit, a cold that steals the breath, that promises a slow death by hypothermia in less than an hour. Life rafts inflated, small islands of hope in the vast, indifferent ocean. The men swam desperately, pulling their comrades aboard, the wounded first, then those choking on the lingering fumes of chlorine gas. On the bridge, Captain Karl Adolf Schlitt remained. He watched until the last of his men were clear, honoring the timeless naval tradition. The captain is the last to leave his ship. He took a final survey of the submarine that had been his command for a mere 8 days. Then, he climbed down from the conning tower and plunged into the frigid water. Adrift, the survivors watched as U-boat 1206 sat motionless on the surface, wallowing in the swells. Abandoned. Doomed. The end came not with a roar, but with muffled thunder from below. Geysers of seawater erupted from the submarine's hull as the charges detonated. The pressure hull, the boat's very heart, was breached in multiple locations. The sea rushed in, a torrent of dark water reclaiming its own. The submarine began to settle, its bow dipping lower and lower as the forward compartments flooded. Within 3 minutes, the bow was gone. Within 5, the conning tower vanished beneath the waves. And in just 8 minutes, the entire vessel slipped beneath the surface, a final, silent surrender. All that remained was an expanding circle of disturbed water and floating debris. From the life rafts, the crew bore witness to the death of their boat. For some, a strange and sudden peace. They had survived. The war, for them, was over. A prisoner of war camp was a far better fate than drowning in a sinking coffin. For others, a burning shame. A humor vessel not by the depth charges of a destroyer, not by the keen eye of a patrol bomber, but by a catastrophic equipment failure. An engineering marvel, a titan of the deep, defeated by its own complex plumbing, by a high-pressure toilet. Circling above, the Sunderland flying boats were not predators, but witnesses. Their radios crackled to life, reporting the submarine's sinking and the precise location of survivors. Royal Navy rescue vessels were dispatched at once. The cold calculus of war gave way to the ancient, unwritten law of the sea. You rescue those in peril, even the enemy. Within 2 hours, the silhouette of HMS Airedale, a British destroyer, appeared on the horizon. The rescue was swift, professional, a display of battlefield chivalry. The German sailors, enemies of the Crown just hours before, were pulled from the water and given aid. Their war had begun with a meritorious combat, but of a profound, almost comical failure, forever sealed in the memory of the men who survived U-Boat 1206. The lines snaked across the churning gray water of the North Sea. British sailors, faces etched by wind and salt, hauled on them, pulling life rafts closer. From the rafts, figures emerged, ghosts from a steel tomb. They were the crew of the German submarine U-1206, and they were wet, exhausted, and choking on the ghosts of a chemical war. As they stumbled onto the deck of an enemy warship, they were no longer hunters. They were prisoners. A medical officer moved among them, a grim triage under an unforgiving sky. 3 men were in critical condition, their lungs seared by chlorine gas. They vanished below decks, their fate uncertain. The others, shivering uncontrollably, were wrapped in coarse blankets and handed mugs of steaming, bitter tea. Their war was over. The submarine's commander, Captain Karl Adolf Schlitt, was escorted to the British captain's quarters. He was a man in shock, his mind still reeling from a catastrophe that had unfolded in mere minutes. The questions came, clipped and professional. What happened? Why did your boat surface so suddenly? Was it a mine? An attack from the air? Schlitt's answer landed in the small cabin with the weight of absurdity. A toilet. A malfunction in the high-pressure sanitation system. The British officers exchanged glances. A joke, perhaps. A desperate, clumsy attempt at a cover story. But as they interrogated the other crew members, one by one, the stories aligned. The impossible, humiliating truth began to solidify. The official report, filed later by the British captain, would carry a note of sheer incredulity. Enemy submarine lost due to catastrophic failure of its toilet system. In the sprawling, muddy prisoner-of-war camps, the story of U-1206 became a legend of dark humor. It was a gallows joke, told in whispers between men who understood the fragility of their steel coffins. How did your boat go down? Depth charges? A torpedo? A relentless hunter-killer group? The answer, when it came, was always met with a moment. Equipment failures were a constant gnawing fear for every submariner. A faulty valve, a cracked pipe, a short in the electrical system. Any one of these could spell doom hundreds of feet beneath the waves. Every man had a story. But to lose your boat, your command, your comrades, to a piece of plumbing, that was a uniquely shameful fate. For Captain Schlitt, the humiliation was a private hell. His first command, a brand-new Type 7C U-boat, one of the most advanced weapons of its time. He had been at sea for just 8 days. He had sunk no enemy ships. He had fired no torpedoes. He had lost his vessel not to the Royal Navy, but to a design flaw in the head, and 4 of his men were dead. They had not died in the heat of combat. Their end was not heroic. It was a slow, agonizing process that began when seawater reacted with the battery acid below the toilet compartment, unleashing a cloud of poisonous chlorine gas. The 4 deaths were a quiet tragedy that played out in the life rafts, even after the submarine had slipped beneath the waves. 3 of the men had inhaled too much of the gas. In the clean, open air of the North Sea, their lungs were already destroyed from within. They drowned in their own fluids, gasping for a breath that would never come. A 4th man succumbed to the cold. He had been in the freezing water too long, his body shutting down degree by painful degree. These men were not casualties of war in the way history remembers. They were casualties of a toilet. Their names were added to a list that was already tragically long. Over 30,000 German submariners perished during the Second World War, a staggering mortality rate of nearly 75%. They were men who accepted the terrible odds, who went to sea hear U-boats torn apart by enemy action. They went down with their ships, in fire and twisted steel. The men of U-1206 were denied even that grim dignity. They died because their captain, in a moment of crisis, couldn't operate a high-pressure toilet. A complex machine of war, a nation's hopes riding in its belly, undone by the most mundane of human failures. The guns of Europe fall silent. May 1945. Amid the ruins and the reckonings, a new kind of war begins. A war of intelligence, fought in quiet interrogation rooms, and from the testimonies of captured German sailors, a bizarre story surfaces. A ghost from the deep. The tale of U-boat 1206. British naval intelligence, piecing together the fragments, saw more than just a strange maritime accident. They saw a window into the German war machine. The submarine's final, fatal secret was not a new torpedo or a revolutionary engine. It was its toilet. A high-pressure, deep-water sanitation system that was a marvel of over-engineering. British analysts pored over the schematics. They saw the German mind at work, ingenious, precise, and fatally overcomplicated. The system was designed to function at the crushing depths where other submarines were blind and helpless. But its operation required a symphony of valves and levers, a precise sequence that, if performed incorrectly, would turn the device from a convenience into a weapon against its own crew. The official report concluded that in the hands of an untrained operator, under the relentless stress of a combat patrol, human error was not a risk. It was an inevitability. The British saw a profound lesson in the wreckage, that sometimes the simplest solution is the most robust. That a holding tank was infinitely preferable to a piece of technology so unforgiving it could sink a warship. The pursuit of perfection had created the perfect instrument of failure. For the man who presided over that failure, Captain Karl Adolf Schlitt, the war's end was merely the beginning of a different kind of imprisonment. He remained in a British prisoner of war camp until 1947. Upon his release, he returned to a Germany in ashes, hoping to rebuild a life. But the story of U-1206 was a ghost that haunted his every step. In the tight-knit world of former U-boat commanders, the whispers were deafening. He was not a veteran, he was a punchline. The captain who lost his boat to a toilet. Every job application was a trial. How does one explain a service record that ends not in a blaze of glory or a valiant defeat, but in a cascade of seawater from a plumbing mishap? The question hung in the air of every interview, unspoken but deafening. Schlitt drifted through a series of jobs, a man living in the shadow of a potential he could never realize. The respect afforded a submarine commander was a world away. He rarely, if ever, spoke of his time in the Kriegsmarine. When pressed, he would admit his command, but any questions about his boat's fate were met with a wall. He would deflect, change the subject, retreat into a fortress of silence built over decades. Years turned into decades. The Second World War transitioned from memory into history. As memoirs were written and archives were opened, the strange tale of U-1206 found a new life. It became a piece of wartime folklore, a staple in books about military blunders and bizarre disasters. Each retelling polished the legend, sometimes sacrificing fact for a better story. The nuances were lost. The technical complexity, the stress of the crew, the humanity of the captain, all were sanded away, leaving only the absurd, unforgettable core. A German submarine, sunk by its own toilet. Historians and journalists, smelling a unique story, came calling. They sent letters. They made phone calls. Most were met with silence. Schlitt had no desire to participate in his own humiliation, to give fresh voice to the story that had defined and derailed his life. Then, in 1984, a German naval historian conducting meticulous research on the Type 7C U-boat finally broke through. Perhaps it was the man's technical focus, his interest in the machine rather than the mockery. Perhaps, at 69 years old, Schlitt felt the pull of history, a final duty to set the record straight. He agreed to an interview. In his home in northern Germany, the retired captain finally recounted the events. His telling was not one of drama or emotion. It was the cold, precise report of an engineer. He spoke of the mission's objectives, the patrol route, the state of the crew, and then he described the toilet. He detailed the sequence of valves, the buildup of pressure, the single catastrophic error. He was not telling a story of shame. He was filing a final, long-overdue incident report, explaining the mechanics of his own undoing. He was describing a machine, a complex and unforgiving system of pipes and pressure. A system that, with one wrong turn, could unleash the full destructive force of the ocean. The year is 1984. In a quiet home in northern Germany, an old man sits opposite a historian. He is 69 years old, retired, his life now measured by the slow turning of the seasons. For decades, he has carried the weight of a story he refused to tell. A story of failure so profound, so absurd, it had become a footnote of naval legend, a dark joke whispered among submariners. Now, finally, he is ready to speak. His account begins, not with emotion, but with the cold precision of an officer delivering a report. He describes the mission, the patrol, the state of his vessel, the U-boat designated U-1206. He details the decision to use the high-pressure toilet, a marvel of engineering designed for deep-sea operations. A system of breathtaking complexity installed in the claustrophobic confines of a steel tube beneath the waves. Then he arrives at the heart of the matter, the cascade of failures. His voice remains steady, a deliberate monotone recounting a catastrophe. He acknowledges his own mistakes, a litany of small errors, each one compounding the last. He should have summoned the engineering officer at the first sign of trouble, when the intricate system refused to flush correctly. He should have been better trained, more intimately familiar with the schematics before attempting a manual override. He should have recognized the danger signs, the subtle shifts in pressure, the groans of a system under strain. But as he speaks, the story broadens. It moves beyond personal error into a landscape of systemic flaws. The toilet itself, a flawed design rushed into service. The training, utterly inadequate for the complexities of the new technology. The instruction manuals, unclear and poorly translated. And above it all, the immense, unspoken pressure on a U-boat commander to complete his mission, to push through equipment problems, to make do. An environment where a single mistake was not just possible, but inevitable. The historian shifts the focus. He asks about the 4 crew members who did not survive. It is here, in the quiet of his home, that the calm, technical facade finally fractures. Karl Adolf Schlitt's voice wavers. The loss of his submarine was a professional disgrace. The deaths of his men, that was a burden that had haunted every day of his life since. 3 of them had been killed by the creeping, acrid cloud of chlorine gas, a chemical reaction born from seawater meeting battery acid. They were young men, barely into their 20s. They had survived months of terror, of depth charges and silent running, of hunting convoys in the blackness of the Atlantic. They were killed 8 days into a routine patrol, not by an enemy destroyer, but by a toilet malfunction. The 4th man was a veteran, a submariner forged in the crucible of the Battle of the Atlantic, a man who had served through the worst years of the war. He had survived everything the Allies could throw at him. He did not fall to an enemy torpedo. He was not lost in a daring attack. He froze to death in the unforgiving cold of the North Atlantic because his captain had made an error with the plumbing. Schlitt confessed that he thought of those men every single day. He wondered if their families knew the truth, if they blamed him for the sheer, pointless tragedy of their sons' deaths. He replayed the moments again and again, searching for a different choice, a different action that might have saved them. After their capture and release from prisoner of war camps, the surviving crew of U-1206 simply vanished. They dispersed across a broken Germany. Some returned to their hometowns, others emigrated, seeking a new life far from the memories of the war. For other U-boat veterans, post-war Germany was a time for reunions, for shared stories of valor and survival. But for the men of U-1206, there was only silence. They never organized a single reunion. There was no shared pride to commemorate, no glorious last stand to toast. Their story was not one of valor, but of a bizarre, fatal embarrassment. A secret they preferred to lock away. For years, most declined requests for interviews, refusing to relive the incident that had ended their war in humiliation. And so the old commander sat in his home, decades later, unburdening himself to a historian. The interview concluded, the tape recorder switched off. But for Karl Adolf Schlitt, the story never truly ended. The quiet hum of his house could not drown out the memory of rushing water, the sting of chlorine in the air, or the faces of the men he had lost. A captain's war is never truly over. It is fought again and again, in the silent depths of memory, long after the last mission has ended. In the cold, gray depths of the North Atlantic, a German U-boat was more than a vessel. It was a predator, a complex and lethal machine engineered for a single purpose: to hunt and to kill. But the story of U-boat 1206 is not one of glorious combat or of a valiant struggle against the enemy. It is a story of a fatal flaw, born not from a torpedo or a depth charge, but from a ghost in the machine itself, an error buried deep within its state-of-the-art systems. The commander, Karl Adolf Schlitt, should have been better trained. He should have understood the intricate dance of valves and pressurized air that governed the submarine's advanced deep-water toilet. He should have recognized the warning signs. But the reality of war is a brutal calculus of risk and necessity. The training was rushed, the manuals dense and unclear, and the pressure from high command to complete missions, to produce results regardless of mechanical quirks, created a crucible where human error was not just possible, but inevitable. When asked, years later, about the 4 crewmen who perished, the historian noted that Schlitt's voice, once firm with a captain's authority, wavered. The loss of his first command, a steel coffin now resting on the seafloor, was a professional failure. The loss of his men, that was a wound that would never heal. 3 of them were young men, barely into their 20s. They had endured months of suffocating tension on perilous patrols, living on the knife's edge of discovery. They had survived the hunters, only to be killed by the hunted. 8 days into a routine mission, a catastrophic toilet malfunction unleashed a torrent of seawater. It met the battery acid below, and in the claustrophobic confines of the hull, a chemical nightmare was born. Chlorine gas, a poison that filled their world and then their lungs. The 4th man was a veteran, a seasoned submariner who had stared into the abyss of the Battle of the Atlantic and had not flinched. He had weathered the concussive blasts of depth charges, the terror of near misses, the silent dread of the enemy hunt. He survived it all, only to die of hypothermia in the frigid embrace of the North Sea. He froze to death because his captain made a mistake with the plumbing. Every day, Schlitt confessed, he saw their faces. He wondered if their families knew the truth, if they cursed his name in quiet moments. He replayed the sequence of events, a torturous loop of what-ifs, searching for a different choice, a single action that might have saved them. In the bleak confines of the prisoner of war camps, the story of U-1206 became a legend of a different sort. A piece of gallows humor whispered between captured German submariners. The question was always the same. How did your boat go down? The answers were a litany of wartime horrors. A depth charge attack, a torpedo from an enemy submarine, an airstrike. Then came the crew of 1206. Their answer was met first with disbelief, then with a strange mix of laughter and sympathy. The toilet broke. This was something else entirely. Malfunctions were common. Every man who served beneath the waves had a story of a failing system, a near disaster averted by luck or ingenuity. But to have your war machine, your apex predator, sunk by a toilet? It was a uniquely humiliating fate. For Captain Schlitt, the humiliation was absolute. His first command had lasted just 8 days. He had sunk no enemy ships. He had lost his submarine not in a blaze of glory, but to a cascade of failures originating in a sanitation compartment. And 4 of his men were dead. Not heroically in the heat of combat. They died in life rafts after the submarine was abandoned. The 3 young crewmen, already ravaged by chlorine gas, were in the open air, yet they were still suffocating. Their lungs, seared by the chemical reaction, had failed them. They drowned in their own fluids, gasping for a breath that would never come. The veteran, who had been in the icy water too long before he could be pulled into a raft, simply shut down. His body, exhausted from the fight for survival, surrendered to the cold. These men were casualties of a toilet. Their names were etched onto the long, somber list of U-boat crewmen lost during the war. Over 30,000 German submariners perished in the Second World War, a staggering mortality rate of nearly 75%. Most died fighting, engulfed by fire and twisted metal, their final moments a testament to the brutal realities of naval warfare. But for 4 men from U-boat 1206, the end came not with a bang, but with a fatal and deeply human error. A complex weapon of war undone by a simple, flawed design. The cold, dark waters of the North Atlantic were a graveyard for thousands, a realm of silent hunters and sudden, violent death. Most submariners met their end in the fury of combat, victims of depth charges, torpedoes, or the relentless pursuit of enemy destroyers. Their stories are etched into the annals of naval warfare. But the fate of U-boat 1206 was different. Its crew was not undone by an enemy they could see or fight. They were defeated by a marvel of German engineering, a piece of technology designed for comfort and stealth that became their undoing. They were defeated by their own toilet. To understand this almost unbelievable chain of events, one must first understand the unique pressures of life beneath the waves. For a U-boat, surfacing was a moment of extreme vulnerability. Disposing of human waste presented a genuine tactical problem. Ejecting it at shallow depths could leave a trail for pressure, deep-water toilet. A system designed to expel waste even hundreds of feet below the surface, compressing it into a small, dense package that would sink without a trace. It was an ingenious device, a complex symphony of interlocking valves and pressurized chambers that required a specialist to operate. A dedicated technician on every U-boat was trained in its intricate sequence. A single mistake in the order of opening and closing the valves could unleash the full, crushing force of the ocean into the submarine's hull. On April 14, 1945, with the war in its final desperate weeks, U-boat 1206 was on its first combat patrol. At a depth of 200 feet off the coast of Scotland, Captain Carl Adolf Schlitt encountered a problem with this very system, it a picture of cascading failure. Believing he knew the procedure, the captain himself attempted to operate the toilet. He made an error. A torrent of seawater erupted into the compartment, unstoppable. The water flooded the submarine's batteries directly below, triggering a chemical reaction that filled the enclosed space with deadly chlorine gas. There was no choice. Choking, blinded, the crew had to surface. An emergency blow of the ballast tanks sent the crippled U-boat rocketing to the waves, into the broad daylight, and directly into the path of British patrols. Damaged, filled with poison gas, and unable to dive, the submarine was helpless. Captain Schlitt gave the order to scuttle the boat and abandon ship. Of the 50 men aboard, 3 drowned in the chaotic escape, and 1 was killed by an Allied aircraft. The rest, including the captain, were captured. The war was over for them, ended not by a torpedo, but by a plumbing mishap. In the prisoner of war camps, the story of U-boat 1206 became a source of grim fascination for British intelligence. They studied the salvaged plans, marveling at a design that was both brilliant and fatally over-engineered. Their final report concluded that simpler systems were vastly preferable to technology that held the power to sink a vessel if misused. It was a lesson in the dangers of complexity, a footnote in the grand history of the war. For Carl Adolf Schlitt, that footnote became the defining sentence of his life. After his release in 1947, he returned to a shattered Gernaun. He was the man who sank his own submarine with its toilet. The quiet whispers, the averted gazes, the professional doors that remained closed, they were the echoes of that single, catastrophic error. The shame was a constant companion, a shadow from which he could never fully escape. For decades he deflected questions, offering only the barest details of his service. But as the war receded into history, its stranger tales began to surface in popular culture. The legend of U-boat 1206 grew, a bizarre anecdote in books about military blunders, a cautionary tale stripped of its human cost. Finally, in 1984, a 69-year-old Carl Adolf Schlitt agreed to an interview. He was ready to reclaim the narrative, to explain the sequence of events that had haunted him for nearly 40 years. He spoke not of a joke, but of a terrifying cascade of system failures under the immense pressure of war. In the vast, unforgiving theater of the Atlantic, where steel behemoths battled for supremacy, the fate of one vessel was sealed not by a weapon of war, but by a simple human mistake. A reminder that in the most complex of machines, the most vulnerable component is always the one that designed it. Deep beneath the waves of the North Sea, a predator moved in silence. A marvel of German engineering, the Type 7C U-boat was a steel shark, a vessel designed to cripple the arteries of Allied shipping. But the weapon that would send U-boat 1206 to the ocean floor was not an enemy depth charge. It was not a well-aimed torpedo, nor a catastrophic engine failure. The instrument of its destruction was far more mundane, infinitely more absurd. It was a high-pressure toilet. Years after the war, its commander, Carl Adolf Schlitt, would recount the events of that day. His testimony was a fortress of facts, a technical and dispassionate account delivered with the precision of an officer still on duty. He detailed the mission, the patrol route, and the fateful decision to personally operate the complex sanitation system. He spoke of the casca-fragile world. He did not shirk responsibility. He admitted his mistakes with a soldier's candor. He should have summoned the engineering officer at the first sign of trouble. He should have demanded more rigorous training on a system so notoriously temperamental. He should have seen the warning signs, the subtle shifts in pressure that hinted at the looming disaster. But his story was also an indictment of a system stretched to its breaking point. The toilet itself was a triumph of over-engineering, a needlessly complex solution to a simple problem. The training provided to crews was cursory at best. The operating instructions, often just a laminated card bolted to a bulkhead, were cryptic and easily obscured by the perpetual damp and grime of a submerged vessel. And above all, there was the relentless pressure from high command. A pressure to stay on patrol, to complete the mission, to make do with faulty equipment in an environment where the smallest mistake was lethal. An environment where such failures were not just possible, but inevitable. The historian interviewing him then shifted the focus. He asked about the men, the 4 crew members who never made it to the surface. And here, the commander's voice, for the first time, wavered. The carefully constructed dam of composure began to crack. The loss of his submarine was a professional failure. The loss of his men was a wound that would never heal. 3 of them had been so young, barely into their 20s. They had endured months of suffocating tension, of near misses and terrifying depth charge attacks. They had survived the hunters, only to be killed by the hunted. As seawater reacted with the battery acid below, it unleashed a cloud of chlorine gas, a poison that filled their steel tomb, choking the very air from their lungs. They died 8 days into a mission that was supposed to be routine. A 4th man was lost to the cold. He reached the surface, but was consumed by the unforgiving embrace of the North Sea. Too long in the frigid water, his body simply shut down, unable to fight the creeping hypothermia. These men were casualties of a toilet malfunction. Their names were inscribed alongside the more than 30,000 German submariners lost during the Second World War. A staggering mortality rate of nearly 75%. But most of those 30,000 died fighting an enemy they could see. Most went down in a blaze of combat. The dead of U-boat 1206 were killed because their captain could not correctly operate a toilet. Post-war analysis laid bare the fatal complexity of the device. It was a 7-step sequence, as precise and unforgiving as disarming a bomb. Valve 1 controlled the toilet bowl. Valve 2, the waste chamber. Valve 3 unleashed the compressed air. Valve 4 opened the vessel to the sea. Valve 5 rinsed the system. Valve 6 equalized the pressure. Valve 7 drained the chamber. Each step had to be executed in perfect order. The pressure gauges had to be watched with an eagle's eye. A delicate ballet of mechanics performed in a cramped steel coffin hundreds of feet beneath the surface. Under ideal conditions, the system was manageable, but conditions in a U-boat were never ideal. The lights were kept low to conserve precious battery life, casting the cramped compartment in a perpetual twilight. The instructions were often smeared with grease or salt spray, and there was the constant humming stress of the deep, the ever-present knowledge that an enemy destroyer could be tracing their shadow from above at any given moment. It was in this crucible of darkness and fear that a simple human error became a death sentence. A single valve, opened out of sequence, transformed a marvel of engineering into its own executioner. The sea, held back by a thin steel hull, found its opening. The hunter became the tomb. A weapon of war, undone not by the fury of battle, but by a flaw in its most basic design. In the silent, crushing dark of the North Sea, a submarine is a world unto itself. A self-contained universe of steel, sweat, and relentless pressure. Every single component, from the torpedo tubes to the diesel engines, is a masterpiece of precision engineering, designed to withstand the immense forces of the deep. The design assumes perfection. It demands it. But it is a world inhabited by men, and its intricate systems, no matter how brilliantly conceived, must ultimately answer to the human hand. A hand that can be tired, distracted, a hand that can make a mistake. For Captain Lieutenant Karl Adolf Schlitt, commander of U-boat 1206, the moment of reckoning came not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet solitude of the vessel's head. The submarine's toilet was a high-pressure, technologically advanced system, a necessity for a craft operating at depths where the sea outside exerted a crushing force of 87 pounds on every square inch. Its operation was a complex, multi-step procedure, a ritual that required focus. In the dim light of the compartment, with the weight of command on his shoulders, Schlitt's focus faltered. He opened the discharge valve first, valve number 4, a simple turn of a lever, but it was the wrong turn in the wrong order. He had bypassed the system's safeguards, creating a direct, open channel from the vast, angry ocean into the heart of his submarine. The sea roared in. An unstoppable jet of frigid North Sea water, driven by the full might of the depths, blasted into the tiny compartment. The force was so immense that closing the valve was no longer possible. The mechanism was jammed shut by the very pressure it was meant to contain. The initial hiss of a leak became a torrent, a violent invasion. The engineering officer, summoned by the alarm, made a brutal but necessary choice. The only choice. He sealed the watertight door to the toilet compartment, a single, decisive action that saved the rest of the submarine from immediate, catastrophic flooding. Had he hesitated, U-1206 would have plunged to the seabed in minutes, a steel tomb for all aboard. But in saving the vessel from one fate, he condemned it to another. The water, now trapped, had nowhere to go but down. It poured through the deck plates, snaking through cable passages, cascading into the compartment directly below, the battery room. Here lay the U-boat's power source. 2 immense banks of lead-acid batteries, each cell brimming with a highly corrosive electrolyte of sulfuric acid. As the cold Atlantic brine met the acid, a violent chemical reaction began, an unholy marriage of elements, birthing a new, silent killer. Chlorine gas. Heavier than air, the chemical ghost sank, pooling in the lowest decks, a creeping yellow-green tide of death. Chlorine is a viciously efficient poison. At a concentration of just 15 parts per million, it irritates the throat. At 30, it triggers immediate chest pain, coughing, and violent vomiting. At 100 parts per million, it attacks the lungs, causing them to fill with fluid. Drowning on dry land. The concentrations inside U-1206 soared far beyond that lethal threshold. The gas, invisible and insidious, began to spread through ventilation ducts and open hatches. Men in adjacent compartments felt it first as a catch in their throats, then a searing fire in their eyes and lungs. The submarine's air filtration system, designed to scrub carbon dioxide, was utterly useless against this new chemical enemy. There was only one escape, one desperate gamble. They had to surface, to vent the poisoned air and breathe again. But to surface was to die another way. They were deep in enemy territory, off the coast of Scotland, one of the most heavily patrolled stretches of water in the world. To break the waves in broad daylight was not an escape, it was an announcement, a death sentence. Schlitt gave the order, the only one he could. With ballast tanks blown, the crippled U-boat surged upwards, bursting through the surface into the gray afternoon light. For a fleeting moment, the crew could gasp for clean air. But they were seen. Instantly. On radar screens, by spotters on the coast, by the ever-present eyes in the sky. The British response was immediate and overwhelming. The first to arrive were the Sunderland flying boats, their engines a grim drone in the sky. Then, the horizon filled with the silhouettes of destroyers and corvettes converging on the wounded Wolf. The most advanced weapon of its era, a predator of the deep, a marvel of engineering that had cost millions to build and train a crew for, was brought down. Not by a torpedo, not by a depth charge, not by a daring act of naval combat. It was undone by a moment of human error, in a system that had no room for one, a complex machine of war, defeated by its most mundane facility. The North Sea churned above. For Captain Karl Adolf Schlitz and his crew, the surface was a death sentence. To remain afloat, crippled and exposed, was to invite the inevitable rain of bombs and torpedoes from the circling British patrols. There was no escape, no chance to fight. The U-boat, a predator of the deep, was now helpless prey. The decision was not a choice, but a grim necessity. To deny the enemy their prize, the secrets of its technology, its codebooks, its very soul, the submarine had to die by its own hand. The scuttling charges were set. For decades, the steel carcass of U-boat 1206 rested in the cold, silent dark. 300 feet below the waves, it became a forgotten footnote in the annals of a global war. Its position was a mere coordinate in British naval archives, a ghost ship deemed unworthy of recovery. While other U-boats were raised for intelligence analysis or consecrated as official war graves, this vessel was abandoned to the sea. Time and salt water began their slow, relentless work. The proud gray hull corroded, its sharp lines blurring into the seabed. A new kind of life took hold. What was once a hunter became a habitat, an artificial reef colonized by the silent creatures of the abyss. Then, in 1999, the silence was broken. A team of technical divers, guided by old naval records and the ghostly pulse of side-scan sonar, rediscovered the wreck. It sat upright on the seafloor, a haunting monument partially swallowed by sediment. The conning tower, though heavily decayed, was still a recognizable silhouette against the murky green. The divers' lights cut through the darkness, revealing a scene of controlled destruction. Gaping holes, blown in the forward and aft sections, were the clear signatures of the scuttling charges, the final, defiant act of its crew. The conning tower was beginning to collapse under its own weight, yet the deck gun remained, a skeletal form encrusted with a thick shroud of marine growth. Venturing inside the wreck, where the structure permitted, they found a vessel frozen in its last moments of chaos. Tools lay where they were dropped. Equipment sat idle at abandoned stations. Personal items, the small talismans of lives hastily left behind, littered the compartments. It was a tomb, but also a time capsule. Yet one area remained inaccessible. The toilet compartment, the very heart of the disaster, was too structurally compromised, too dangerous to enter. External inspection, however, confirmed the story. The divers could trace the path where the North Sea had first breached the hull. A fatal cascade started by the simple, urgent need to flush a toilet. Today, the wreck is designated a war grave, a final resting place for the 4 men who perished during the sinking. Further expeditions are discouraged, preserving the site out of respect for the dead. The story of U-boat 1206 has since migrated from the depths of the ocean into the lecture halls of engineering schools. It serves as a stark, cautionary tale, a case study in how elegant complexity can court catastrophic failure. The high-pressure toilet system was, in its own way, a triumph. A marvel of German ingenuity, it solved the difficult problem of waste disposal at extreme depths with sophisticated physics and clever mechanics. But in its brilliance, it violated the most fundamental principle of sound design: simplicity. The more intricate a system, the more pathways exist for it to fail. The more steps required for its operation, the more opportunities arise for human error. A simple holding tank, the kind used by Allied submarines, would have been less advanced, less efficient, and certainly less impressive. But it never could have sunk a warship. The ultimate irony remains buried in the dark off the Scottish coast. A machine built to conquer the ocean, undone by the one system designed to keep the ocean out. In the silent, crushing depths of the North Sea, technology was a god. And the German Type 7C U-boat was its temple. A masterpiece of lethal engineering designed to operate flawlessly under unimaginable pressure. But even the most brilliant designs can be undone by the most basic of human realities. The tale of U-boat 1206 is not a story of heroic combat. It is a lesson, written in salt water and chlorine gas. A lesson learned by every naval engineer since. Today's submarines are built on a different philosophy, not the hubristic pursuit of perfection, but the humble acceptance of fallibility. Systems are interlocked. Redundancies are built upon redundancies. Alarms scream at the slightest deviation from the norm. The goal is brutally simple. No single error, no single moment of human oversight can ever again be allowed to doom the entire vessel. The engineers of the Third Reich designed for a flawless operator. Modern engineers design for human nature. For Karl Adolf Schlitt, the captain, the war ended on April 14, 1940. Newspapers mentioned his service, but delicately glossed over the final mission, citing only technical failures. A quiet pact of discretion, a story too strange, too embarrassing to commit to print. Among the last of the U-boat crews, the memory was sharper. A ghost they all lived with. Some understood. They knew the claustrophobic nightmare below the waves, where a single wrong turn of a valve could unleash the ocean's fury. Others saw only failure, a captain's duty betrayed, a stain on an iron legacy. But they all knew the truth. The 50 men of U-boat 1206 were casualties of the war, as surely as any sailor lost to a depth charge or a torpedo. Their fate was not sealed by enemy action, but by a catastrophic plumbing failure. This detail does not diminish the tragedy. It amplifies it. It distills the entire, sprawling, chaotic nature of conflict into one single, absurd event. In the grand accounting of the Second World War, this submarine is a footnote. 50 lives among tens of millions. Yet the story survives, outlasting tales of greater battles and grander strategies, because it reveals a chilling truth, that deep beneath the waves, in the most advanced war machine of its time, the line between triumph and catastrophe was as thin as a single, improperly operated valve.